Gresham College presents Debussy, Text and Ideas. Debussy, Banville and the Problem with Fixed Form Poems by Dr. David Evans.
This session is entitled Text into Song, and really our three speakers are going to be focusing on much smaller scale text than what we've been hearing about already this morning. Essentially, they're going to be focusing on the French poetic texts that Debussy worked with. Mostly in this session, we're going to be dealing with two very big name French poets, Banville and Verlaine. And tomorrow we'll hear more about Baudelaire and Mallarmé, two other very big name poets. When I say big name poets and include Banville in that list, well, Banville was an incredibly big name poet in his day, but has been largely disregarded or left by the wayside by much of the critical scholarship or even sort of popular books of anthologies of poetry. Banville tends to be overlooked. So I'm delighted that our first speaker today, David Evans from St Andrews, is probably the world's greatest Banville expert, is writing, there's only one, he says, no. He's currently drafting or writing a book on Banville that will appear next year. But also this very interesting question of who Debussy chose to set to music when. And the fact that Banville appears in that list relatively early on in Debussy's songwriting career, before he moves on to then more famous names, if you like, of Verlaine, who we'll hear about later. And just one tiny thing for those of you who are not experts in French poetry, a lot of the elements we'll be talking about when we deal with French poetry is all about just counting syllables and what Debussy does with those syllables. And the particularly problematic syllables are anything to do with the letter E in French. So we've had a lot of punctuation already today. I'm sure we'll have lots about the letter E this afternoon and tomorrow morning. You have been warned. So without much further ado, I'd love to hand over to David Evans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm astounded. I've never had an introduction like that before speaking in my life. I never will again. And the truth is, there's only one person in the world who's actually read Banville. And here I am. So that explains Helen's... it explains Helen's kind words. I'd like to begin then with the sort of statement that I certainly couldn't make at any of the 19th century French conferences that I go to. To wit, in my opinion, probably in the second half of the 19th century, Banville was the most important and stimulating French poet writing at the time. Don't take my word for it. Take Louis Ulbach's word, writing in the Revue de Paris in 1856. The form is fantastic, but does this book contain a single thought or sentiment, idea or passion? Don't take my word for it. Take Barbé d'Aurevilly's word for it, writing in Le Pays in 1856. All Banville's odelettes have this lightness, the grace of a soap bubble in the wind, the transparency of lacework which covers absolutely nothing. Don't take my word for Banville's great importance. Why not consult Paulin Limerac, writing in Le Constitutionnel? What do you call a poet who doesn't have a single idea or sentiment and who just tries to create strange effects with words? Don't take my word for it. Let's ask Jules Lemaitre. Théodore de Banville is a clown in poetry, who in his life has had several ideas, the most persistent of which is to include not a single idea in any of his verse. Let's consult the poet's obituary. This artist, who had the voice of a nightingale, also seems to have had the brain of one. So, where to begin? Banville made his name in the 1850s. It's not his fault that in the same year that Les Fleurs du Mal came out, he also published the one book which really made his name, called Les Odes Funambulesques, which was a satirical collection, light-hearted verse on a very small coterie of Parisian men of letters, and which even 20 years after publication needed the author's own footnotes in order for any of us to understand the references. So Banville made his name, truly finding his voice, I suppose, with poetry which presented the poet as an acrobat performing tightrope tricks with words. And Banville's versificatory prowess was legendary, and that's what made his name. And it is what's important for us, and what I'd like to talk about today is Banville's poetry was very quickly taken to be, around the 1860s, 1870s, was very quickly taken to be the epitome of empty form, performing itself, devoid of any meaningful artistic content, which is why I want to talk about fixed form poetry today. So already in the 1870s, and certainly by the 1880s, when Debussy wrote his first song settings to 13 of Banville's poems, already Banville was not synonymous with a Verlainian impressionism, moonlight, ripples on the water, but Banville was synonymous with a kind of crisis in poetry whereby fixed forms and poetry written in those fixed forms was calling into question its own fundamental meaningfulness as art. If all the poet can do is rhyme, and the verb rimer became kind of pejorative at the time, thanks to Banville's acrobatics, if all a poet can do is rhyme amour un jour, or famously dévotion and putréfaction, as Baudelaire did in 1857, if all a poet can do is rhyme but not tell you any meaningful content, then what does that tell us about the sham of verse art? Which is why at about the same time as these books I'm going to talk about now, what happened, the general response to this kind of aesthetic crisis bubbling underneath the surface of fixed form poetry in the 1860s, Baudelaire's response was to write prose poetry, that is to say, to put a word on the cover of the book which isn't written in verse, which claims that this prose work is in fact poetry and sets you the challenge of working out why it is poetic. Early 1870s, Rimbaud invents free verse, and in the 1880s, writers like Laforgue and Gustave Kahn and Marie Krzyzewska reinvent proper free verse for the first time. Banville's response to this bubbling aesthetic crisis, which he played a massive hand in throwing onto the surface of aesthetic debates with much, much more explicit clarity than Baudelaire did. Baudelaire talked about this sort of thing in his unpublished prefaces to Les Fleurs du Mal. He didn't actually foreground them with anything like the reckless abandon and career-wrecking delight that Banville did. Banville's response is to go back in time and resurrect fixed forms from the late medieval period. So at the time when his contemporaries were writing post-Baudelairean, post-Fleurs du Mal, exciting, zesty, modern poetry, Banville offers us 36 ballads for passing the time, which are 36 ballads pastiching the fixed form which Villon was writing all his ballads in the late medieval period. It sold so little, went so unnoticed, that Banville must have thought it'd be a great idea to do another one 2 years later and publish his 24 Rondels in the style of Charles d'Orléans, which met with a similar fate. And in 1879, when he republished his very first book from 1843, Les Cariatides, he added 24 dizains in the style of Clément Marot. So two main undercurrents, I think. Number one, there's an extended reflection on fixed form here, which I'd like to talk about in relation to Debussy's composition and taking on of this poetry to set later on in his career. The second question is the nationalistic question, I think. The dates aren't a coincidence. Franco-Prussian War, 1870, Siege of Paris into 1871, the esprit de revanche, the spirit for revenge against the old enemy, which was being propagated in French schools throughout the 1870s and 1880s. The French literary industry exploded in the 19th century, whereby critical editions of historical poets around whom the country could construct its own national sense of literary and cultural identity and roots is something that really took off post-1800 and was solidified in the new education system of the 1870s. So that's the backdrop against which this was being written. Our hero, Banville, we are going to talk about Debussy later, but because the conference is called Text and Ideas, I need quite a lot of time to talk about the texts and ideas behind those settings. In 1872, Banville decided to write a book. I have no idea who offered him this, but he wrote a book for school children, which is a 300-page treatise on how to write poetry. And he manages the peculiar rhetorical feat of spending 300 pages telling you how to write poetry, while at the same time telling you that if you follow these rules, what you write will not be genuine poetry at all. And the genuine secret of how to write poetry cannot be taught, all the while teaching you how to write verse. So in 1872, he publishes an auto-booby-trapping manual on how not to write poetry, in which he talks about Rondels and Ballades, in a chapter on fixed forms. Rondels, he says, have the kind of naive grace of the création qu'ont fait les époques primitives. I'll translate where I need to. That quotation reminded me very much of Debussy's most famous quotation, I think, on the shepherd and the flute learning music from the wind that he heard out in the fields. Okay? So, what Banville does with these fixed form poems, that they're very tricky to write. On your handout, you can consult it as and when you like. I've given you all the ballades and rondels that Debussy sets to music in the 1900s. The trick with these fixed form poems is they're set to a very limited number of rhymes. So if you begin with your first two lines on two rhyme sounds, you know that for the rest of the poem you're obliged to come up with enough words to fill in the mechanism so that you can get to the end. So rhyming dictionaries were in heavy use at the time, and you couldn't write a ballad by turning to the page of the rhyming dictionary that only had two words available to you. So fixed form poetry has this built-in formal constraint by which it's very difficult to do well. And in one of these jokey asides to the school children whom he's trying to exasperate, Banville says you can try writing a rondel if you like, by putting all these rhymes together, but you must, the vision of what the poem is like in its finished state must appear to you instantly, otherwise it's not poetry at all. He says a similar thing for the ballade. The ballade, the Villon form, is the most difficult poem to write in French because of the number of words you need on the same rhyme sound. That's a complete lie. You open the rhyme dictionary at a page with a lot of words on. That's how you write a ballad, and it was common knowledge. But he tells his school children, this vision must pop into your head as if unbidden, or you're not writing real poetry. So what I'm trying to get at is fixed form poetry in the 1870s was at the centre of a swirling number of anxieties over genuine art and how to spot it. Are these historical pastiche nothing more than pastiche? And if they are nothing more than pastiche, what do these historical relics tell us about so-called genuine poetry, which is published at the moment in verse forms, which also rhymes? If rhyme is a marker of poeticity and genuine artistic value, and you're offered two rhyming poems, how do you tell the real one from the fake one? And the discourse of fakery and forgery is swirling around in there as well. So Banville tells our school children, if you'd like to write a ballad, there's a mechanical method that you can follow, which makes it really easy. Only if you do that, you're sure of writing a dreadful ballad. i.e., follow the mechanism, produce art on the conveyor belt, and it's not art. So, as you can tell, this whole debate is centred around the rhyme, a formal constraint which lends itself to analysis, and people were anxious about the value of these rhymes. Is poetry, therefore, nothing more than a game of filling in sounds down the right-hand side of your poem? Claire Tisseur is my favourite critic of Banville because Banville's discussion of rhyme sends Tisseur apoplectic with rage. And he fills his treatise on versification in the 1890s with examples of rhymes, for example, malade and cyclade. He says, why cyclade? Why not Marseille if you want a port? I'll tell you why Cyclade, because it's got to rhyme with malade, and the only reason the poet has included this name is because he needed a rhyme for malade. Similarly, have you ever looked at the star Sirius and thought, gosh, that looks like a sinister emir? Of course not, says Tisseur. Of course you haven't, but you will if you have to rhyme with frémir in the next line. Tell you what, he says, why don't we find a rhyme for harmonie? What about insomnie? That's a rhyme, isn't it? What's that got to do with anything? Nothing, he says, but who cares? So this is the demolition. So this is what's happening in the late 1890s, you know, just before Debussy takes these fixed form poems to be set to music. This book by Claire Tisseur, I think, was the crystallization now of the backlash against rhymed mechanical verse. So here is a dizain. That's the first fixed form that we're not going to look at today. I've got about 6 or 7 minutes left, and I'd like to talk about Ballades and Rondels. You will recognize these. That's what a dizain looks like. I've put the rhyme letters down the right-hand side, and you'll see it's a nice, tight, symmetrical form, A, B, A, B, B, C, C, D, C, D. And you know, once you've heard the words contemple, that there's got to be an A rhyme coming. You know when you hear Arlequin that the poet needs 2 more rhymes in un. We know after we read Lys in line 6 that we need 2 more rhymes on délices and coulisses. And Banville was capable of churning this out with great aplomb, relishing the scandal isn't the right word, is it? Relishing the anxieties that he was stirring up as he went. So I've included these 2 because, just as examples, because they are 2 of the 5 dizains by Banville that Debussy set in the early 1880s. So here we are. Debussy was a great fan of Banville. I think he was the first poet that he fell for in the 1879 edition. So the 1879 edition that Debussy was given was the updated version that had these dizains included in Les Cariatides for the very first time. That's how we know which edition he was using. And these are the 13 poems he set, and the 5 at the bottom all come from Les Cariatides, 1879 edition. Now, I've included these quotations because, just before I get to a couple of musical examples, the Debussy criticism industry and the French poetry criticism industry both have a fascination, penchant, soft spot for quotations like Debussy's from the 1880s, where his composition teacher asks him at the Conservatoire, "What's your favourite poet for setting to music?" And he replies, "Celui des choses dites à demi," the one who leaves things half unsaid. And we all sigh and think, yes, just like the moonlight in water in the moonlight, yes, it's so impressionistic. Banville in 1846, so much, much earlier, wrote similar things in the preface to his Les Stalactites, where he talks about expressing in poetry a certain order of sensations and sentiments that you could call musical. And in order to express these musical ideas, you need to leave them in the demi-jour, in the half-light, in the twilight that bathes them. And this is the sort of stuff that we're used to saying about the Verlaine settings, the Baudelaire settings. We're used to that idea. But what we're not used to dealing with at all is fixed form poetry, which is a pastiche on earlier historical fixed forms, which no longer have the same meaning 300 years later that they did at the time of composition. So, I'm not a musicologist, so all I've brought are questions, really, and I'd like to fill up the last 5 minutes with questions. The first question being one that I can't come anywhere close to answering. But the question is, seeing as in fixed form poetry, there is one formal variable, the rhyme, around which there crystallizes an entire aesthetic questioning over how to recognize genuine art when you see it. Is there anything in musical setting, musical expression, which can be a parallel signifier of anxieties? I wonder. Helen and I wrote a short thing on Debussy's Recueillement a few years ago, and the sort of signifiers I remember we talked about were, for example, is it dominant seventh? Is that dysfunctional dominant seventh relationships, where the expected relationship between where the first chord is announced, heralding what you think should be a return to the tonic, and we don't get that return. So, structures which are set up with some kind of malfunction in them. And also, because I have been reading my Debussy scholarship, even though I'm not a musicologist, so this will mean more to you than it does to me, but added seventh and ninth chords. There we are, I've said it. I hope that means something. So, the first thing I was surprised to find is that every time there's a refrain in the text, the refrain actually recurs in the musical setting perfectly faithfully. And I'm at the end of the PowerPoint now. I'd just like to play a quick musical example. So, how about this one? Sorry, I'll announce it first. It's the second one of the Charles d'Orléans settings. It's on page 3 of the handout. And if I wanted to be ruthless about it, I would suggest that there's not much to the poetry, really. If I wanted to be really naughty, I'd suggest it's not even proper art. It's just about being tired in the morning and not wanting to get up when the alarm clock goes, therefore staying in bed. I think that's a very memorable melody, and it recurs in the same form 3 times in the poem. When it recurs at the end, you'll notice that melodic line straddles the first 2 lines of the poem, and in a rondel, you don't repeat line 2 at the end, you only repeat line 1 at the end. Well, Debussy takes the liberty of repeating lines 1 to 4 at the end so that this melody can recur. So I can't see, to be honest, on a musical level, much demi-jour or twilight or half-light in there. There's another detail the first Charles d'Orléans setting, Dieu qui l'a fait bon regarder, this rondel, what I found remarkable about this piece for unaccompanied 4-part choir is that even though it's not in unison throughout, all 4 voices end each line pretty much at the same time. So the structure of the poem could not be clearer in front of your eyes. And the final example, and I think I'll leave us on this because time's up and this is about as far as my musicology goes. In the third Villon setting, I think this could be a clue, and I think it could be the way in. I just don't know what to do with it. The third Villon poem is entitled "The Ballades des Femmes de Paris," and it is nothing more. The content of the text is nothing more than a list of women from different parts of the world. Florentine, Vénitienne, Lombarde, Romaine, Genevoise, Piemontoise, Savoisienne, etc. And the moral of the story, which comes in the refrain at the end of each stanza, is that all these women are renowned for being good talkers, but the best chat is of the women in Paris. And you'll notice, halfway down the third stanza, with 3 lines to go, the poet, Villon, asks the reader, "Ai-je beaucoup de lieux compris?" Which means, have I mentioned enough places yet? Well, no, actually, because you've got 2 more lines left to fill. So after this aside, like, have I filled up the mechanism enough to get to the end of my poem? He's got to do another line, Picarde, Valenciennes, il n'est bon bec que de Paris. And in the setting, which I haven't got time to play, that line is the only point in the entire song that all the music drops away, the soprano drops down onto an E or an E flat, I think, and sort of half speaks the line, Ai-je beaucoup de lieux compris, unaccompanied. before the music sets off again at breathless pace, stumbling over the list of place names, and the whole piece finishes with this kind of triumphant explosion of sound, which almost translates to my ears as a declaration, thank God we've got to the end of that, and I've managed to fill up the mechanism with enough words, empty words meaning nothing beyond their pure multitude. So there, to sum up in one sentence, I think, I'm confident that these anxieties were swirling around behind the use of fixed forms in poetry during this time. I think it's very suggestive that alongside all the clair de lune, Verlaine, Baudelaire settings that Debussy was doing, he came to these later on in the 1900s and did different things with them. He was such a sensitive reader of poetry that I am convinced that he was aware of these similar anxieties swirling away underneath, and I just wonder what that tells our ears to look out for when we listen to the settings, and what our aesthetic response to them as art should be. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
For more information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.